in order to try to convince people to give us money. You know what I mean?
No, I know that's part of it, but it's not all of it.
Go ahead.
Lo en español.
Sí, sí,
Es como lo de los 8 años y 7 años, porque pienso que sea el periodo de y que más que todo con la parte del compromiso. Porque realmente a mí me gustaría que me revisara y que estuviera pendiente más un computador, más otra cosa, que me prepara, pero que tuviera como ese compromiso. O sea, más, yo no veo tanto la licencia como los checklists, como los físicos, más como un tema global, de compromiso, de esta persona que me está chequeando a mí, va a tener el knowledge total de la palabras que puede influenciar. Él responde de su esposa, bueno, o sea, puede que le pida datos internos, usted no sabe, porque usted realmente no sabe bien de física y la forma en que se cayó, que sea general, no lo es pero creo que en cuanto a lo de las licencias y los certificados y todo, debería ser más todo como de la sociedad. Yo voy a un doctor que me dice, oiga, este doctor es bueno. Este doctor no solo digo, no sé, dio una lista y se quedó en el computador y me recetó algo que no me sirve, sino que yo voy a este doctor, no solo por la licencia que me dice, que él tiene el compromiso, que él tiene como los 8 años, 9 años para saber, para tener bien el compromiso de que me va a atender, y es mi salud, no es mi carro, no es algo que es irrelevante, es mi salud y es mi bienestar de aquí al long term. Pero yo creo que es como viéndolo así por los dos lados, me interesa que tenga la experiencia, porque es como un indicador de compromiso, y por lo otro, pues, más que el certificado de todo, me gustaría más como que hubiera la información global.
Yeah. What I understand you is saying is that going through this process of being a doctor, being protected, having this high salary, gives you sort of a sense that you have the responsibility not to fuck up your patient's life. And I think that there's some truth to that. I do believe that ideology plays a role in people's life and so forth. I think the chance that given the systems that we currently have, that that's the most efficient way to get honest advice to people, and that everyone would be interacting with people who are like thieving car mechanics in response to their health otherwise, that seems implausible to me. I just think there's so many good ways of providing information on so many topics. And we know that doctors do respond to material incentives in ways that are not necessarily in the interests of their patients' health. Maybe not as extremely as they would if they didn't have all this protection. That might be true. But still we know that they do. There's lots of evidence of that. So the idea that doctors are transformed into saints this way, I mean, I would trust much more that a computer, which I know has been reviewed to be the thing that actually optimizes the thing, is likely to be right, much more than I would trust that a doctor who's a human being and who has all the corruptions that human beings have is going to do that well. I think we should probably move on, but I'm really glad that this has provoked so much thought and discussion. I'm not saying you should agree with Friedman, that's not the point. The point is that we should think through the economic trade-offs that are going on here and not take for granted that because something is the tradition of the way the society works or the rhetoric that everyone assumes, that it's got to be the right way of organizing.
Just a very small point about predictors, about the best thing to do. It may be so, I would like to see the study, but it could be under-identified, you say, in econometrics?
Yeah.
Because probably what Adventist says is based on 8-year studies of a doctor or many doctors who do research based on what they know about the whole human being and all this stuff. So they're through Adventist or the company, whatever it is, they are getting the same type of knowledge.
You mean through the people that try to persuade them to do their particular best?
Yeah, no, well, not through the marketing people, the people who make the research.
I see. Well, I mean,
So you would be doing the same thing, and you would put in the middle somebody that really doesn't have a real action there more than giving them whiskey and I don't know what other things. But the real thing is that they tell them this is the good one because we did this research, we did this other thing, we understood this biochemical procedure, etc., 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 and that will be probably the reason why they will do that. Plus a little bit from the party and all this stuff. I wouldn't reduce it that much.
I mean, it seems to me that what doctors, as decentralized people, learn, which is not learned by the researchers, is the experience that they have with patients, not in a randomized controlled way, but in a way that can be written down. And in fact, the study that I was referring to shows that doctors learn from that experience. So they do get biased towards whenever they get marketed, but in case of a bad experience with one particular drug, they're less likely to give them in the future. That's completely crazy because we know that randomly people have bad experiences with drugs, even if that's the best drug to prescribe. So by basic statistics, you should be aggregating the whole experiences that everybody has.
We can take all the course discussing this way. Okay, well, probably we'll continue with that.
Okay, so the types of arguments that Friedman was using are things that are going to show up all throughout this class. They include, how do we try to target solutions to exactly the problem? So rather than just having broad licensure, how do we get exactly the problem that exists here? Trying to think about exactly what the market failures would be in the absence of licensure, rather than just putting in this broad system, which might have all these problematic ancillary consequences. How do we try to infer preferences and information from the system? What are the incentives of a monopolist to distort the allocation, as the groups of doctors he was claiming to do? Protecting consumers rather than producers is a priority because of the greater concentration of producer rather than consumer interests. And then the grounding of that in the collective action problems, which we'll talk about later. And as we go through the course, maybe you'll see other areas where economic principles were being used to make the argument that Friedman was trying to make. Okay. So I think this sort of thinking or this sort of argumentation is exciting. I think it's powerful. But the question is it really scientific? So to try to help you think about that, I want to go on to reflect a little bit about what science is with the help of an article that I asked you guys to read by Hilary Putnam. The Putnam is sort of critiquing or in dialogue with three different views about the history of philosophy of science during the 20th century. Is Roman Zarate here? Roman, could you tell me what the first of these groups was the inductivists? What's their view of science?
Pues es que hay hipótesis con diferentes experimentos.
Sí.
Comprobar si las teorías son ciertas o no parte de ellos.
Exactly. So this is basically what you learned in middle school when you were supposed to study the scientific method, right? You come up with a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis. If it turns out to be right, then maybe you continue testing it, or you assume it's true, and you sort of move on to the next step. Popper, on the other hand, is Sergio Aldana? Sergio? What was Popper's view, and how does it differ from that of the inductivists?
Taking information from experiments, he says that logic shall prevail. There's a discussion that we were somewhere else that Popper says that you can't really validate the model, you can only calibrate. The model is true by itself. It's not that the nature will say this model is good or this model is bad. The model is true in itself, and nature only can only give us the values that make the model adjust to reality.
Well, so that is a view that some people hold, but I don't think that's really Popper's view. So Popper's view is closer to the inductivist than that. Popper's view is instead that nature can falsify models, but it can never prove them true. So the inductivist view is, we run these tests. If the test turns out right, then we say, oh yeah, the model is more likely to be true. But Popper says, no, you can never prove the model is true by testing it. All you can do is prove that it's false. And that what models should aim for is to come up with things that could cause them to be proved false, and then they should survive this. And if they survive that, we don't say that they're true, we just say that they've held up against falsification for long enough. Right? So there's a famous Einstein quote that helped inspire this Popperian idea. He said that one experiment could prove me totally wrong, but even a million experiments couldn't prove me right. Okay, so finally, Danielle, what do you think, what can you tell me about what Kuhn's view of the philosophy of science is? And don't cheat by looking at the slides. Does anyone else want to, or do you want to try, or does anyone else want to try on Kuhn? Yeah.
I think you said that basically theories are verifiable. That's what you said. Theories in general are verifiable.
No, so Kuhn takes actually sort of a more radically subjectivist point of view. So Kuhn wants to say that both the inductivists and Popper are totally wrong, because theories are completely unfalsifiable. There's nothing that can be done to prove the theory right or to prove the theory wrong. And that, in fact, all that science is about is not about taking the theory and testing it in any way. Instead, it's about taking the world and making it fit the theory. So he has a very different view of what science is about than Popper and the inductivists do. They say, here's the theory, let's go see if it's right. And what Kuhn says is, no, that's not what we do. We say, here's the theory, let's see how we can understand the world to make it fit with the theory. But, and then in fact there's no criterion for comparing the truth of different theories. The different theories are different languages. Saying one theory is better than another theory is like saying that English is better than Spanish. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you can express the same things in English and you can express them in Spanish. And that's, you know, the development of linguistics is about trying to figure out how to express things in a language. It's not about testing which language is the better language, right? And scientific revolutions come only when people are getting very dissatisfied with their jobs of trying to fit the world into the theory. So he thinks that, you know, we sort of go along for a while and we try to fit the world to the theory, and then it's getting really frustrating to try to do that. And then someone comes along and proposes a different theory, which he doesn't prove is right over the other theory. It just gives people a different thing to try to fit the world into, that people may enjoy fitting the world into. So, Putnam views this, yeah, go ahead.
Es que hay una cosa de pues, que me parece importante, y es que él dice que todos son paradigmas que son consistentes dentro de sí mismos. Entonces, dentro de ese paradigma, uno no puede ligar ese mismo paradigma, que puede verlo desde otro punto de vista. Eso es muy importante.
Yeah, that's what he says when you can't really test them. It's like English, it really is, he uses it like English and Spanish. It's like internally they have a structure and they're consistent, but it's not like they have any way to be compared with one another. So, what Putnam said, Putnam's view in this article is that Kuhn was right to make his critique of the inductivist in Popper, but he's wrong to interpret it in such a radically subjectivist way. The sort of feeling that you get coming out of Kuhn is that science is just completely arbitrary. And that seems like it can't possibly be right. Just look at all the technology that seems to have come from science, right? So it can't be that this is just some random thing that people are just doing. There has to be some value to the process through which science goes. So he tries to show how you can give a more objective, valuable interpretation to what goes on in science. So he says that theories have to be confirmed by the types of tests that we run on them. It's crazy to say that they're just not falsified, because we use the theories that survive falsification for all sorts of things in our lives. And if we didn't believe that those theories were more correct than other theories that hadn't been tested or whatever, then it would be crazy for us to go around our lives using those to determine what to do, right? And therefore, the theories that have survived must be ones that we believe in more. So he thinks that Putnam's view is just crazy, and that you have to believe, if you believe something like Putnam, something more similar to the inductivists. But his main critique is of the view that both the inductivists and Popper have, which is that theories are just going and being tested. It's the same way that Kuhn critiqued that. So he says even the best of theories, even the most famous things that you would think are the most successful scientific theories, almost never imply any prediction which can be falsified on their own. So he gives the example of the theory of universal gravitation by Newton, because this is probably the most famous, most successful scientific theory of all time. But he still claims that it's completely unfalsifiable. And Sergio, could you describe why he thinks that?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
He was saying that Newton's law says only gravity, the law of gravity that was to the gravitation. But this system, this universal gravitation system, relies on some inquiry statements. And when you find a mistake or something that doesn't make sense, the thing that goes false, that is proved false, is not the universal gravitation theory, but the inquiry statement.
Yeah.
And he gives the example of you ran something in the children.
Yeah.
Where he said that, well, I don't remember exactly the story right now, but it's like there was a mistake in the calculations and there was supposed to be a different orbit or whatever. And they found out that there was another planet that they were taking into account, so the inquiry system of only n planets putting into account.
Yeah.
That's wrong, so they decided to update it, but they never falsified the universal gravitation.
Exactly right. So he says that, the standard assumption, so if you ask, what was the great success of universal gravitation? Why did we decide it was such a great theory? Well, the reason is it was able to predict what are called Kepler's laws, which are the laws of planetary motion. And how did it predict those? Well, it assumed that there are, and this is literally true, all the calculations that Newton did, all the calculations that were even possible to do until like the 19th century, assumed that for every planet, there were only two planets, the sun and that particular planet. That those two planets were in a vacuum, and that there were only the forces of gravitation operating with them. So what is true of these ancillary statements? First of all, they're not only false, but they're internally inconsistent with one another. That is, the ancillary statements that we use to predict one planet's orbit is inconsistent with the other one, because we assumed when we were looking for the orbit of Venus that there was no such thing as the Earth. And when we were looking for the orbit of the Earth, there was no such thing as Venus, right? Second, they're totally inconsistent with other things that we know. Like the fact that there's lots of other forces operating, that these things aren't in vacuums, that there's all sorts of asteroids going around all over the place. And so these things are completely false. So if we make a prediction based on these, to say that that falsifies universal gravitation would be completely crazy. Because clearly the assumptions that are going in to making a prediction based on it are completely wrong. So clearly it would be the assumptions that are wrong, not the theory. And he points out that almost everything that we call a success of a theory or a falsification is of that form, where all the assumptions that are going into making the prediction are completely wrong. And therefore, a failed prediction almost always leads us to revise the ancillary assumptions, not the fundamental theory. And if you start thinking about economic models you've read or debates you've read in economics, you'll pretty soon start to recognize that. But that's not something that's special to economics. That's something that's a general feature of science. And the example of Uranus and Neptune is a great one of those. And if you think that doesn't still go on in science, and have any of you ever heard of dark matter? So dark matter is this thing that physicists came up with because if you apply the theory of general relativity to the known universe, the predictions are completely wrong on the biggest stuff, which is like, is everything going apart or is everything coming together and so forth. So they said there must just be a bunch of stuff that we can't see. It's just floating around there, holding the universe together. Okay, well maybe that's true. But it's certainly not the case that general relativity, based on the things that we know exist, predicts the universe that we see. So if you're going to try to falsify general relativity, it's done, right? It's false. So anyway, what Putnam tries to say then is that science can't possibly be people going out and testing and falsifying theories. That's just a crazy view of what's going on. Instead, he views science as being a series of steps. So one of the most common things that we do is that we have a theory and we know some facts about the world. And then we try to think what other facts could be true of the world such that the things that we see would actually be consistent with the theory. And if you think about it, that's a lot of what we do in economics. You know, we have some paradigm, and then we say, oh, what must be going on in terms of the competition between these companies in order to predict the patterns that we observe. We don't go out there and try to test our basic understanding, the fundamental theories of industrial organization or a rational actor model. Instead, we think, what must be people's motivations or what must be the configuration of the industry that would produce the outcomes that we describe. Putnam calls this his schema 2. Another schema, which is more similar to the inductivist view, is that we have some ancillary assumptions that we've come up with somehow, maybe from one of these exercises here where we're trying to fit some things, and we came up with an ancillary assumption like that Uranus exists, right? And then we use that to make some other predictions, and then we go out and we see whether those predictions hold up. But the important thing to notice about this, which is fundamentally different from what the inductivists say, is that if in this stage things turn out not to work, we never reject the theory. We just go back to this stage. And we say, okay, what was missing? What was wrong about the assumption that I made? Here, let me try to find another assumption that also makes the theory consistent with the world. Okay, sorry, that was his schema 1. But the schema here, which is another point which is totally left out of the standard Popper view, is a lot of what we do is we try to deduce from some set of assumptions what are the predictions made by those assumptions. A lot of theory in economics is that. We actually spend a lot of time doing the actual logical, mathematical derivations from some set of assumptions to what the prediction is, rather than actually going out and testing or coming up with anything new. So the Popper and inductivist view leaves out a large part of what actually goes on in science. And nonetheless, Putnam doesn't want to agree that things are just subjective. And the reason that he doesn't is that he thinks that despite the fact that we would never falsify a theory based on one of these predictions, that doesn't mean that the theory is just infinitely flexible. And the reason is that, what made universal gravitation such a compelling theory? It's that you could take some really, really wildly unrealistic assumptions that nonetheless seem kind of like they might be worth playing with, and generate really good predictions about the world. And if you've ever, I don't know if you've ever had that experience with an economic model where you're like, wow, we threw into this assumptions that are completely wrong, but yet we might have some semblance of what might be one of the more important aspects of what's going on. And yet the power of the model was precisely that it could take such incredibly simplistic assumptions and get you something that seems pretty plausible about what's going on in the world, right? So that's really the success of a model, is its ability to take incredibly oversimplified assumptions that are very unrealistic and leave out all sorts of things, and map them into something that gives you a sense of what actually might happen. And therefore, models are never falsified by that type of an exercise. They can only be sort of confirmed by it in a certain sense. And what happens is if for many years people go on and a model is no longer generating those exciting moments, people start to get disillusioned about it and to look for other things that might be able to generate those exciting moments. So that's the way that Putnam tries to reconcile Kuhn's debate with Popper and the inductors. And I think that if you keep in your mind that sort of a feeling, and realize that that's what really goes on in science, that science, the hard sciences that economists often seem to envy and think are so much better, are really just doing that as well. You'll be much less likely to be led into a lot of the fallacies that I think economists have because they think they want to be more like scientists. They want to be so precise. They want to be so falsifiable. When in reality, that's not actually what happens in science either. Okay, so that view that Putnam's pushing is one in which theories are really just languages. And the ancillary statements are sort of like sentences in those languages. And like languages, there are some things that are really easy to say and some things that are really hard to say. So I'll give you an example. In English, there's two words that my wife uses a lot in her research. One is called enforcement, and one is forbearance. So enforcement is when I enforce the law against, you guys probably know what enforcement means. There's no word for it in Spanish, right? You can say hacer cumplir la ley, but it doesn't really capture the same meaning of like, I'm going and I'm actually making a reality out of the things that are written down. And forbearance is the opposite. It's when I have the right to enforce something, but I choose not to. But again, there's no real word in Spanish for that either. And on the other hand, there's other things that are harder to express in English. So there's an opposite sort of an expression in Spanish, hecho la ley, hecho la trampa, which is one of my favorite Spanish expressions, which is something that's very hard to say in English. So, anyway, the value of a theory is in what it allows us to say. What it makes easy for us to say, and what it makes hard for us to say. And therefore, I think that teaching theory, and I hope you'll see this throughout my course, is all about examples and applications. The theory itself has no content outside of the ways in which we learn to apply that theory. So when you do examples and applications, I don't want you to think of those as taking an abstract principle and then doing some example of it as some dirty thing that you do just so you can get a sense for the general theory. It's precisely the content of the theory is the ways in which it's applied, because the theory itself is completely non-falsifiable and infinitely flexible.